Waiter insulted Snoop Dogg in a luxury restaurant, but when he discovered the truth, you won't believe what happened next. Diego, a waiter drowning in personal struggles, lashed out with subtle condescension toward a seemingly unassuming diner in sneakers and a hoodie. Little did he know, the man was none other than Snoop Dogg, conducting a secret experiment to reveal the truths of human judgment. As tensions peaked, Diego's assumptions unraveled in a stunning twist. The man he resented for flaunting wealth was a philanthropist championing the very causes Diego held dear. The night ended not with shame, but with an extraordinary job offer and the chance to rewrite his future. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss out. Thunder rolled across Los Angeles like a drum beat from heaven, each crash punctuating the steady rhythm of rain against the windows of Harmony Haven. The restaurant stood as a beacon of warmth against a tempestuous night, its cream-colored walls painted with dancing shadows from the storm outside. Through the steamed windows, crystal chandeliers cast a gentle glow across white tablecloths and gleaming silverware, creating an atmosphere that whispered of exclusivity and refinement. Inside, the air carried the rich aroma of truffle oil and aged wine, mingling with the subtle scent of rain that leaked in each time the heavy oak doors opened. The soft murmur of conversation floated through the dining room, accompanied by the delicate clink of fine china and crystal glasses. In one corner, a pianist's fingers danced across ivory keys, the melody weaving through the storm's fury. The maitre d' stationed near the entrance maintained a careful watch over her domain, her perfectly manicured fingers resting lightly on the reservation book bound in burgundy leather. Every detail of Harmony Haven had been cultivated to appeal to Los Angeles' elite. From the hand-painted murals depicting scenes from classical mythology to the imported Italian marble floors that gleamed like mirrors beneath the warm lighting. Against this backdrop of carefully curated luxury, the storm outside seemed to grow more intense, as if nature herself was determined to breach the sanctuary of wealth and privilege. Rain lashed against the windows with renewed vigor, and the wind howled through the narrow streets of downtown LA, sending scattered leaves and debris dancing past the restaurant's entrance. Before decorating a vertically hidden door, Slade had painfully poked more holes in the structure that would hold close to 50 people. It was at this moment that a figure appeared through the tempest, hesitating just outside the golden pool of light spilling from Harmony Haven's entrance. Snoop Dogg stood there, water dripping from his hooded sweatshirt, the designer label long since soaked through. His tall frame was slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight, and his usually sharp eyes were clouded with exhaustion. He remained motionless for a long moment, watching the scene inside through rain-streaked windows, his breath fogging the glass. "Just one night," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible above the storm. No cameras, no fans, just peace. His fingers traced absent patterns in the condensation on the window, and for a brief moment, something like vulnerability flickered across his features. The legendary rapper looked less like an icon and more like a man seeking shelter from more than just the rain. Taking a deep breath, Snoop pushed through the heavy doors, bringing with him a gust of wet air that made the candles flutter. The hostess, Laura, looked up from her station, her practiced smile faltering slightly as she took in his casual attire. Her gaze traveled from his scuffed sneakers to his rain-soaked hoodie, and her perfectly penciled eyebrows arched almost imperceptibly. "Good evening," she said, her tone carrying just a hint of frost. "Do you have a reservation?" Her manicured fingers hovered over the leather-bound book, though she made no move to open it. Snoop met her gaze steadily, too tired to play the usual celebrity game of recognition and deference. "No reservation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his exhaustion. "Just looking for a quiet table." Lara's lips thinned almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked tonight." Perhaps you'd prefer somewhere more—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Casual." Without a word, Snoop reached into his pocket and withdrew a crisp $100 bill, placing it on the podium with deliberate care. The money wasn't about buying his way in. It was about avoiding the song and dance of celebrity, about remaining anonymous for just one evening. Lara's eyes flickered to the bill, then back to Snoop's face. Something in his expression must have registered because her professional mask softened slightly. She tucked the money into her pocket with practiced discretion and reached for a menu. "Table 15, she said, her voice lowered. "In the corner. It's relatively private." She gestured toward a secluded table partially hidden behind one of the restaurant's ornate marble columns. "Your server will be with you shortly." As Snoop followed her through the dining room, he could feel the weight of curious glances from other diners. Even in his casual attire, something about him commanded attention. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being watched. Or maybe it was simply his height and presence. But tonight, he kept his eyes focused on the table ahead, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller in the space. The table was indeed private, offering a view of both the storm-lashed windows and the rest of the dining room while remaining partially concealed. As he settled into the high-backed chair, Snoop let out a long breath, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. The white tablecloth before him was pristine, the silverware gleaming under the soft lighting, and for a moment, he allowed himself to hope that here, in this corner of luxury and refinement, he might find the peace he was seeking. Less than/ant thinking greater than. Behind the kitchen's swinging doors, Diego Martinez stood at the service station, his crisp white shirt and black vest a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions churning beneath his professional exterior. The weight of his phone in his pocket felt like lead, each vibration a reminder of the mounting bills and desperate text messages from his sister Maria. He'd stopped checking them an hour ago. There was nothing new he could tell her about their mother's chemotherapy payments or her own overdue tuition. Running his fingers through his meticulously combed dark hair, Diego glanced at his reflection in the polished surface of an espresso machine. At 28, he was already developing fine lines around his eyes, etched there by years of double shifts and sleepless nights spent calculating how to stretch his tips further. The exclusive clientele of Harmony Haven never seemed to notice these details about their servers. The subtle signs of exhaustion, the careful way they counted their tips, the silent calculations running behind their practiced smiles. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Education is everything, mijo." She'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, only to have cancer derail her plans for both her children. Now, instead of using his business degree, Diego found himself trapped in the same service industry that had consumed his mother's youth. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, serving $500 bottles of wine to people who spent more on dinner than his mother's monthly medication costs. A new message vibration cut through his thoughts. Diego pulled out his phone, his jaw clenching as he read Maria's latest update. Mom couldn't keep anything down today. "Doctor says we need to try the new treatment protocol, $12,000. Diego, what are we going to do?" The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in his chest as he did the math again. His savings account held exactly $4,327.89. Everything he'd managed to scrape together over the past year. The credit cards were maxed out, and the hospital had already denied their request for a payment plan extension. Each shift at Harmony Haven brought in decent tips, but it was like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. "Hey, here is a Diego." Sophia's voice cut through his brooding. She stood at the pass-through window, her dark eyes studying him with a mixture of concern and impatience. "Table 15 needs attention, and Thomas is watching, so try to keep the attitude in check tonight." Diego forced his features into neutral submission, though he couldn't quite suppress the bitter taste in his mouth. Every night, He watched Los Angeles's elite drop thousands on vintage wines and truffle-topped everything, while his mother rationed her pain medication to make it last longer. The injustice of it all felt like a physical presence pressing against his ribcage, making it harder to maintain the subservient smile expected of him. "Fine dining," he muttered under his breath, straightening his bow tie with practiced precision. "Where the rich come to pretend they're royalty, and we pretend we don't hate them for it." The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of years of accumulated resentment. Less than / ant thinking, greater than. The hairs on my arms were starting to stand up, and I tugged a few pieces of hair out. In the kitchen's controlled chaos, Chef Jules stood at his station, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his phone screen. The French chef's typical scowl deepened as he scrawled through the restaurant's latest online reviews. "Sacre bleu, listen to this nonsense," he announced to no one in particular, his accent thickening with indignation. "The duck confit was too crispy, too crispy. These people wouldn't know proper duck confit if it flew into their faces and quacked." Sophia, who was expertly garnishing a row of plates nearby, couldn't suppress her laugh. "At least they didn't say it was undercooked this time," she teased, adding a precise drizzle of aged balsamic to each dish. Her dark curls escaped from beneath her chef's cap as she worked, and her quick movements spoke of years of experience in high-end kitchens. "Remember last week's review? The medium-rare steak was pink in the middle." "Don't remind me," Jules groaned, though a slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "These critics think they're on some cooking show, playing at being experts. But can they tell the difference between sauce béarnaise and hollandaise? None." Iago, who had been organizing his service station nearby, felt his irritation spike at their casual banter. How could they joke about reviews when real problems, life and death problems, loomed just outside these kitchen walls? Still, he found himself drawn into their conversation, if only to distract himself from the weight of his phone in his pocket. "Speaking of critics," Sophia said, glancing toward Diego with a knowing look, "your table 15 looks like he might be another self-proclaimed food expert. Saw him come in wearing sneakers and a hoodie, in this weather no less." She nodded at Diego. "Probably another tech millionaire trying to prove he's still connected to the streets," Diego muttered, arranging his serving towels with unnecessary force. "They come in here playing dress down, then drop 5 figures on wine just to show they can." Chef Jules raised an eyebrow at Diego's tone. "Remember, mon ami, their money pays our bills, even if they order their steaks well, done with ketchup." He shuddered dramatically at the thought, providing a moment of levity that Diego couldn't quite appreciate. As Diego prepared to approach table 15, his reflection caught his eye in one of the kitchen's polished steel surfaces. The perfect bow tie, the precisely pressed shirt, all part of a costume he wore to serve people who would never know or care about his reality. His mother's face flashed in his mind, pale, drawn, but still trying to smile through the pain. The contrast between her quiet dignity and the casual extravagance of Harmony Haven's clientele made his hands shake slightly as he adjusted his sleeve cuffs. The man in the hoodie at table 15 represented everything Diego had grown to resent: the assumption of privilege, the casual disregard for convention, the implicit belief that money could smooth over any social friction. Without having exchanged a single word, Diego had already cast him as another antagonist in his personal drama, another symbol of the inequality that kept his mother sick and his sister's dreams of education just out of reach, less than / ant thinking greater than. Diego approached table 15 with measured steps, each movement carefully controlled to project the professional demeanor expected at Harmony Haven. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, creating an oddly fitting soundtrack for what he'd already decided would be another predictable interaction with another wealthy patron playing at being casual. The man sat hunched slightly over his phone, his hoodie still damp from the rain. In the soft lighting, shadows played across his features, highlighting the exhaustion etched there, His long fingers tapped absently against the pristine tablecloth, creating a rhythm that seemed unconscious, almost meditative. "Good evening, sir," Diego began, his voice carrying just the right note of polite detachment. "I'm Diego, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." He placed the leather-bound wine list and menu on the table with practiced precision, noting how his customer barely glanced up from his phone. "May I start you with something from the bar?" The man in the hoodie finally looked up, his eyes sharp despite their weariness. "Whiskey," he said simply. "Neat, whatever's strongest." His voice was low, measured, carrying an underlying tone that Diego couldn't quite place, something between resignation and amusement. Diego's lip curled slightly, though he maintained his professional mask. "We serve Macallan 18-year-old single malt," he said, his tone carrying just a hint of challenge. "It's $145 per pour." He emphasized the price slightly, waiting for the inevitable hesitation or change of order. Instead, the man simply nodded. "That's fine." His gaze returned to his phone, fingers still tapping that quiet rhythm against the tablecloth. The casual acceptance of the price point only served to irritate Diego further. He'd seen this type before, or thought he had. Tech entrepreneurs, trust fund babies, crypto millionaires, all trying to prove they belonged in places like Harmony Haven, while deliberately dressing down to show they were above its pretensions. "Very good, sir," Diego replied, the words coming out slightly clipped. "Would you like a moment with the menu, or shall I make some recommendations? Perhaps something—" He paused deliberately. "Accessible?" The man looked up again, and this time there was something in his expression that gave Diego pause, a knowing glint that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "What would you recommend?" he asked, his voice carrying no trace of offense at the implied condescension. Diego's jaw tightened imperceptibly. The man's composure was somehow more infuriating than any reaction of anger or embarrassment would have been. "Our chef prepares an excellent foie gras," he said, his tone growing more pointed. "Though it's perhaps an acquired taste, the soup du jour might be more suitable." "The foie gras sounds good," the man replied, closing the menu without even looking at it. "And the filet mignon, medium rare." He held Diego's gaze steadily. "Bring a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild as well." Diego's eyebrows rose fractionally. The Lafite was one of their most expensive wines, priced at $2,500. "Sir," he began, unable to completely hide his skepticism, "perhaps I could suggest something more appropriate. We have several excellent Merlots that might better suit your," he glanced pointedly at the man's casual attire, "preferences." A faint smile played at the corners of the man's mouth. "The Lafite will be fine," he said quietly, his calm assurance somehow making Diego feel like he was the one out of place in this exchange. As Diego walked back toward the kitchen, his thoughts churned with frustration. The interaction had left him feeling oddly unsettled. There was something about the customer's demeanor that didn't fit his predetermined narrative. A quiet dignity that resisted his attempts at subtle humiliation. A self-possession that seemed to render his condescension ineffective. The man's apparent wealth only fueled Diego's resentment. Another evening of serving obscenely expensive wines to people who would never know what it meant to choose between paying for medication or education. His mother's face flashed in his mind again, and with it came a fresh wave of bitterness. How many rounds of chemotherapy could be paid for with the cost of that single bottle of wine? How many semesters of Maria's tuition? The orders for table 15 burned in his mind like an indictment of the system he both served and despised. Each item, the premium whiskey, the foie gras, the Lafite, represented another small fortune casually spent by someone who probably wouldn't even appreciate their true value. Yet, something about this particular customer's quiet confidence nagged at him. suggesting that perhaps his assumptions weren't as accurate as he'd like to believe. Less than/and thinking greater than. Back in the kitchen, Diego yanked open the wine cellar door with more force than necessary, the heavy oak groaning in protest. Sophia watched him from her station, where she was arranging delicate microgreens on a row of appetizer plates. Her dark eyes followed his agitated movements as he descended into the temperature-controlled room below. "Let me guess," she called after him, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. Table 15 ordered the house wine and asked for ketchup with their well-done steak. She heard him snort in response, his footsteps echoing as he navigated the shelves of expensive vintages. "Worse." Diego's voice floated up from the cellar. "Hoodie in sneakers orders a Lafitte like he's asking for a glass of water. Probably made his money selling NFTs or something equally ridiculous." There was a pause as he located the bottle. $2,500 of wine for someone who probably can't tell it from $2 Chuck. "My clients shy away from price." Everyone nodded in response. Sophia's lips twitched as she added a perfect spiral of aged balsamic to each plate. "Maybe he's a tech billionaire," she suggested, playing along. "You know the type, trying to prove they're still connected to the streets while dropping more on dinner than most people make in a month." Diego emerged from the cellar, cradling the precious bottle of Lafitte. "He didn't even look at the menu, Sophia. Just ordered the most expensive everything like he was at a drive-thru." He carefully placed the wine on the service counter, his movements precise despite his irritation. "Meanwhile, my mom's rationing her pain meds because insurance won't cover the full prescription." "Diego," the new voice cut through their conversation like a knife. Thomas, the restaurant manager, stood in the doorway to his office, his carefully pressed suit and severe expression a reminder of Harmony Haven's standards. "A word, please." Inside the small office, Thomas closed the door and gestured for Diego to sit. The walls were lined with framed reviews and awards, testament to the restaurant's prestigious reputation. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he began, his tone measured but firm. "And I've noticed your attitude toward certain customers has been slipping lately." Diego straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I maintain complete professionalism with all our guests," he said, the words coming out slightly stiff. "Do you?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Because I've received feedback about subtle condescension, suggested wine more appropriate to customers' perceived status." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This isn't just about service, Diego. It's about the reputation of Harmony Haven. We can't afford to have our servers making assumptions about guests based on their appearance." As Thomas spoke, the sound of laughter drifted in from the dining room, carefree, unburdened laughter that made Diego's fingers curl against his thighs. The contrast between that sound and the memory of his mother's quiet sobs over medical bills felt like salt in an open wound. "Maybe some time passes before you recover fully," Thomas continued, either not noticing or choosing to ignore Diego's tension. "And we'll need to have a more serious conversation about your future here." The warning hung in the air between them, clear and unmistakable. Diego nodded stiffly and rose to leave. As he reached for the door handle, Thomas added softly, "We all have our struggles, Diego. Don't let yours blind you to the humanity of others." "Oh, my sister Elise has a strength that no man can dispute. My Aunt Tessie was the ultimate kindness and compassion." The words followed Diego back into the kitchen, where Sophia shot him a sympathetic glance. The Lafitte still waited on the service counter, its presence somehow more provocative now. As he gathered the wine opener and crystal decanter, Diego could feel his frustration crystallizing into something harder, more dangerous. Thomas's warning, rather than tempering his attitude, had only stoked the embers of his resentment, less than/and thinking greater than. Diego returned to table 15 with the Lafitte and decanter, Thomas's warning doing little to soften his demeanor. The rain had intensified outside, drums of thunder punctuating the refined atmosphere of the dining room. In the warm lighting, the crystal decanter caught and scattered light across the white tablecloth like scattered diamonds. "Sir," Diego began, his voice carrying a razor's edge of politeness, "before I opened this rather significant investment, perhaps you'd like me to explain the wine's profile." He placed the decanter with careful precision, watching his customer's reaction. These subtle complexities might be surprising for someone new to fine wines. Snoop looked up from his phone, that same calm amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. "Please," he said simply, gesturing for Diego to continue. The single word somehow managed to convey both permission and challenge. Diego began the ritualistic presentation of the wine, each movement precise but laden with subtle condescension. "The Chateau Lafite Rothschild is considered one of the world's premier wines," he explained, his tone suggesting he was speaking to a child. "It might be quite different from what you're accustomed to, more sophisticated than, say, a California Red?" "I'm familiar with the Lafite," Snoop replied quietly, watching as Diego began to open the bottle. "Particularly the 82 vintage, though this 86 should pair nicely with the filet." His casual display of knowledge caused Diego to nearly fumble the cork extraction, though he recovered quickly. The slip only served to fuel Diego's irritation. As he began to pour the wine with exaggerated care, he couldn't resist another dig. "Perhaps next time, sir, you might want to explore our selection of more accessible wines. We have several excellent options under 3 figures that might be more appropriate for casual dining." Several nearby diners glanced their way, the edge in Diego's voice carrying further than he'd intended. "You know what I find interesting?" Snoop said, his voice still carrying that hint of amusement. "How quickly people make assumptions based on appearances." He took a deliberate sip of the wine, his appreciation evident but understated. "Though I suppose that works both ways, doesn't it?" The comment struck too close to home, causing Diego's professional mask to slip further. "Will you be requiring detailed explanations of the menu items as well?" he asked, his sarcasm becoming more overt. "Our chef creates rather sophisticated dishes, nothing like fast food or street vendors. Less than, and thinking, greater than." Snoop set his wine glass down with deliberate care, his movements carrying the practiced ease of someone who had dined in the finest restaurants across the globe. The crystal made no sound as it met the tablecloth, a small detail that somehow emphasized the growing tension in the air. "You know," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to reach nearby tables, "I've found that true sophistication isn't about knowing the price of things." He gestured slightly with one long-fingered hand, encompassing the elegant dining room. "It's about recognizing the value of people, regardless of how they're packaged." The observation, delivered with the timing of a master performer, caused a couple at the next table to pause their conversation, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. The woman whispered something to her companion, her eyes widening with sudden recognition. "Though I have to admit," Snoop continued, a hint of genuine amusement warming his tone, "your performance tonight is pretty entertaining, better than most shows I've seen lately." He reached for the wine glass again, his casual grace making Diego's stiff formalities seem almost comical in comparison. "Keep going. I'm curious to see what assumptions you'll make next." The subtle shift in the dining room's atmosphere was almost palpable. A well-dressed executive 2 tables over had stopped mid-bite, his fork hovering between plate and mouth as he strained to hear the exchange. His dining companion was less subtle, openly staring at Snoop with growing amazement. "Is that? Yes?" The whispered question rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. Phones began to appear discreetly beneath table edges, their cameras aimed toward the corner table. The maitre d' noticed the growing disturbance, her professional smile faltering as she tried to gauge whether intervention was necessary. Diego, still oblivious to his customer's identity, interpreted the room's shifting attention as validation of his contempt. "Perhaps Sir would like me to explain how to properly use each piece of silverware," he suggested, his sarcasm becoming more overt. "Or shall I simply bring everything with a spoon?" "Actually," Snoop replied, pulling his phone from his pocket and placing it carefully on the table, its camera lens glinting in the soft lighting, "why don't you tell me more about what you see when you look at me? It's fascinating, really, like a case study in prejudice and fine dining." His words carried no heat, only a kind of amused curiosity that made them all the more devastating. By now, the couple at the adjacent table had abandoned any pretense of their own conversation. The woman was rapidly typing on her phone, while her companion kept glancing between Snoop and Diego with the anticipatory expression of someone watching a slow maple collision about to happen, /then/and thinking greater thing. Diego retreated to the kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he input the wine order into the computer system. The price of the Lafite flashed on the screen. $2,500, the numbers burning into his consciousness like a brand. In his pocket, his phone vibrated again, and he knew without looking that it would be another message from Maria about their mother's medical bills. The juxtaposition of these two realities, the casual extravagance of his customer's order and his family's desperate struggle, made his vision blur with barely contained rage. The memory of his mother's face during her last hospital visit rose unbidden in his mind. She had tried to smile through her pain, telling him not to worry, that everything would work out somehow. But he had seen the fear in her eyes when the doctor discussed the new treatment protocol, had watched her hands twist in her lap as the costs were outlined. 20 years of her life spent cleaning other people's houses, serving other people's families. All so her children could have opportunities she never had. And now, when she needed help the most, all he could offer was the meager savings from serving overpriced wines to people who spent more on dinner than his mother's monthly medication costs. His customers' composed demeanor and subtle jabs only amplified Diego's sense of powerlessness. Each measured response, each calm deflection of his struggles felt like a mockery of his struggles. The man in the hoodie represented everything Diego had grown to despise: the casual wielding of wealth, the ability to move through the world without consequence, the luxury of finding amusement in others' bitterness. Sophia approached cautiously, noticing his white-knuckled grip on the computer terminal. "Diego," she said softly, "maybe you should take a break. I can cover table 15 for a while." The concern in her voice only fueled his anger. He didn't need pity, he needed justice. Needed a world where his mother's life wasn't worth less than a bottle of wine. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his rigid posture suggested otherwise. "Just processing how someone can drop thousands on dinner while wearing clothes from Target." The words came out harsh, bitter, carrying the weight of years of accumulated resentment. Chef Jules looked up from his station, his usual theatrical complaints about picky customers forgotten as he observed Diego's mounting tension. "Mon ami," he began, uncharacteristically serious, "this customer of yours, there is something familiar about him, no? Perhaps we should—" "Familiar?" Diego cut him off with a sharp laugh. "Yeah, familiar. Like every other rich guy playing at being down to earth while they cosplay poverty in designer sneakers." He grabbed a service tray with more force than necessary, the metal clattering against the counter. From the dining room, the growing murmur of excited whispers should have caught his attention, should have warned him that something was shifting in the carefully maintained atmosphere of Harmony Haven. But Diego was too consumed by his internal storm to notice the signs. Each time he glanced through the service window and saw his customer sitting there, perfectly at ease, despite the mounting tension, it felt like another twist of the knife in his gut. The man's phone still sat on the table, its camera lens catching the light like a watching eye. There was something deliberate about its placement, something almost theatrical about the way its owner seemed to be documenting their interaction. But Diego missed these subtle warnings, too caught up in his own narrative of injustice to see the bigger picture unfolding around him. "Diego," Sophia tried one more time, her voice urgent now as she glanced at her own phone screen. "You really need to see this. That guy at 15. But Diego was already pushing through the kitchen doors, his jaw set and his patience unraveling like a poorly wound thread. Less than / and thinking greater than... When Diego returned to table 15, Snoop had pushed his empty plate aside and sat back in his chair, his posture relaxed but somehow commanding more space than before. The phone still lay on the table between them, its camera lens reflecting the chandelier light like a silent witness. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, providing a baseline to the tension building in their corner of the restaurant. "Do you see something else?" Snoop said, his voice carrying that same measured calm that had been needling at Diego's composure all evening. "What do you see when you look at me?" He gestured to his casual attire with a slight movement of his hand. "Beyond the hoodie and sneakers, I mean. What story are you telling yourself?" The question caught Diego off guard. He stood straighter, his serving towel twisted unconsciously between his fingers. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," he replied, his professional mask slipping slightly. "Would you like to see the dessert menu?" "Nah, man," Snoop said, leaning forward slightly. "Let's be real for a minute. You've been serving judgment with every course. I'm curious about why." His eyes, sharp despite their apparent weariness, seemed to see right through Diego's facade. "What makes you think you know anything about my story?" Around them, the dining room had grown quieter, as if the other patrons were holding their collective breath. The maitre d' hovered uncertainly near her station, watching the interaction with growing concern. But in that moment, Diego could only focus on the strange intensity of his customer's gaze and the uncomfortable feeling that he had somehow stumbled into a conversation much deeper than the usual server-client exchange. "I've been in this business a long time," Snoop continued, his fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the table. "Seen all kinds of people, all kinds of assumptions. Sometimes the ones judging others the hardest are carrying the heaviest burdens themselves." The observation landed like a precise strike, somehow both gentle and devastating. Less than / and thinking greater than. Diego felt his professional mask cracking under the weight of Snoop's steady gaze. The serving towel in his hands became a twisted rope as he struggled to maintain his composure. "With all due respect, sir," he began, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "You don't know anything about my burdens. You come in here throwing around money like it's nothing, while people out there..." He caught himself, but not before the bitterness in his voice revealed more than he'd intended. "Go on," Snoop encouraged quietly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Diego's growing agitation. "People out there what?" The question hung in the air between them, an invitation to cross a line that Diego had spent years carefully maintaining. "People out there are dying because they can't afford basic medical care," Diego burst out, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. "My mother!" He stopped again, horrified at how quickly his professional veneer had crumbled, but the dam had broken, and words spilled out despite his attempts to contain them. "Do you know what that bottle of wine could pay for? 3 months of chemotherapy? 6 months of my sister's tuition? But sure, let's talk about my assumptions." Through Diego's outburst, Snoop remained perfectly still, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. The phone on the table continued recording, capturing every word of Diego's unexpected confession. Around them, other diners had abandoned any pretense of not listening, their own meals forgotten in the drama unfolding at table 15. "Life's got a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them," Snoop said finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Sometimes the person you're judging might be the one who understands your struggle better than you think." He reached for his water glass, the movement deliberate and unhurried. "You see this hoodie and these sneakers, and you think you know my story. But maybe I chose this outfit tonight for a reason. Maybe I wanted to see who'd treat me differently based on how I look. The calculated nature of Snoop's experiment began to dawn on Diego, adding a new layer of discomfort to his already churning emotions. He noticed for the first time how the other diners' attention seemed to amplify rather than disturb his customers' composure, as if he were completely accustomed to being the center of attention. "Your mother's situation," Snoop continued, his tone gentling slightly. "That's real pain, real struggle. I respect that, but using that pain to justify treating people like they're less than you?" He shook his head slowly. "That's not honoring her sacrifice, that's letting bitterness win. Less than / ant thinking, greater than." Sophia burst through the kitchen doors, her dark curls escaping from beneath her chef's cap, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and panic as she spotted Diego near table 15. The urgency in her movement caught the attention of nearby diners, adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. "Diego," she hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him slightly away from the table. "You need to see this right now." Her fingers trembled slightly as she thrust her phone toward him, the screen displaying a recent social media post. There, in high-definition clarity, was a photo from last week's Children's Hospital charity gala. The caption read, "Snoop Dogg donates $2 million to pediatric cancer research, continuing his commitment to healthcare access for underprivileged communities." The image showed their customer in an elegant tuxedo, his distinctive features unmistakable despite the formal attire. Diego's eyes darted between the photo and the man sitting at table 15, his brain refusing to make the connection. "No," he whispered, his face draining of color. "That's not... It can't be..." "It is," Sophia insisted, scrolling rapidly through more photos. "He's been doing undercover visits to restaurants all over LA, documenting how service changes based on appearance. It's part of some social experiment for his new documentary about class prejudice in America." The pieces started falling into place in Diego's mind, like dominoes toppling in slow motion. The phone recording on the table, the casual confidence in ordering expensive wines, the way he deflected every insult with practiced ease, the growing excitement among the other diners. Every interaction from the evening replayed in his head, taking on new and mortifying significance. His customer, Snoop Dogg himself, continued to watch him with that same measured gaze, but now Diego could see the layers of purpose behind it. This wasn't just a wealthy patron tolerating poor service. This was a cultural icon deliberately documenting prejudice in action. Every condescending comment, every subtle dig Diego had made was likely captured on that innocuous-looking phone. The realization hit him with physical force, making his knees weak. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Judge not, mijo, until you've walked in their shoes." How many times had she told him stories about being prejudged in her cleaning jobs, about wealthy employers assuming she was ignorant just because she spoke English with an accent? And here he was, perpetuating the same behavior he'd grown up hating. Snoop's earlier words took on new meaning. Sometimes the person you're judging might be the one who understands your struggle better than you think. Of course he understood. He'd built his entire career on breaking down barriers and defying expectations. While Diego had been making assumptions about him ordering expensive wine, Snoop had been quietly donating millions to help people exactly like Diego's mother. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade away as Diego stood frozen between Sophia and table 15, the full weight of his behavior crashing down around him. His carefully constructed justifications for his attitude crumbled in the face of this revelation. All those bitter comments about rich wannabes and trying to feel important now reflected back on him, revealing more about his own prejudices than his customers' worth. Less than / ant thinking, greater than. Snoop reached for his phone, stopping the recording with a deliberate tap. The dining room had grown so quiet that the sound seemed to echo, punctuated only by the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. He looked up at Diego, who stood frozen between flight and apology, and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down for a minute," Snoop said, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had maintained all evening. "Let's talk about what happened here tonight." It wasn't a request, despite its gentle delivery. Around them, other diners leaned in slightly, abandoned plates cooling as they witnessed this unexpected moment of truth. Diego sank into the chair, his legs no longer quite steady enough to hold him. Sophia hovered uncertainly nearby, torn between leaving and staying to support her colleague. Snoop acknowledged her with a slight nod, and she retreated to a discreet distance, still within earshot, but no longer part of the intimate tableau. "You know what's refreshing about you, Diego?" Snoop began, leaning forward slightly. "You're honest. Not in the way you think, not in your words or your service, but in how clearly you show what's eating at you inside." He gestured to the wine bottle between them. "Every time you mentioned the price of something, every time you tried to make me feel small, you were really telling me about yourself." He paused, letting the words sink in. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating his features with an almost theatrical timing. "See? I've been doing this little experiment at high-accent spots across the city, testing how people treat me based on what I'm wearing, not who I am. Most servers just get quietly condescending. They hide their judgment behind professional smiles. But you," he shook his head almost admiringly, "you let your pain show through. That's rare in a world where everyone's trying to hide their truth." Diego opened his mouth to speak, but Snoop held up a hand, his rings catching the light. "I'm not finished, because here's the thing. That honesty you've got, that fire inside you, that's valuable. Not when you're using it to tear people down, but when you channel it into seeing what others miss, into speaking truth to power, into making real change. Less than/ant thinking, greater than." Diego sat in stunned silence, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The bow tie at his throat suddenly felt too tight, the pristine white of his shirt too stark against his trembling hands. Every interaction from the evening played back in his mind with crushing clarity. Each snide comment, each condescending suggestion, each moment of barely veiled contempt now revealed as testament to his own prejudice rather than his customer's worth. He began, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say to justify his behavior to someone who had just donated millions to help people exactly like his mother? The irony of it burned in his chest like acid. He had spent the evening looking down on a man who was actively working to solve the very problems that kept him awake at night. A memory surfaced. His mother sitting at their small kitchen table, counting out pills from her prescription bottle, trying to make them last longer. "Everyone has a story, mijo," she had told him once. "The real sin is thinking you know someone's story just by looking at them." The shame of having betrayed this fundamental lesson his mother had tried to teach him made his eyes sting. Around them, the dining room had become an impromptu theater, with other patrons providing a running commentary in hushed whispers. A woman at the next table leaned close to her companion, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard. "That's Snoop Dogg, the one who just funded the new children's wing at Cedars-Sinai." From another table, "Isn't he the one who's been doing that documentary about service industry discrimination?" The executive who had been watching earlier was now openly filming with his phone, while his dining companion rapidly typed on hers, no doubt sharing the unfolding drama on social media. Each murmured observation, each clicking phone camera, added to the weight of Diego's realization. His private moment of prejudice was becoming a public lesson in humility. "This is going viral," someone whispered loudly enough to carry across the now silent restaurant. "The waiter who tried to shame Snoop Dogg." The words felt like physical blows. each one highlighting the magnitude of his misjudgment. Less than / ant thinking, greater than. The revelation of Snoop's identity transformed Harmony Haven into an impromptu stage, with every diner and staff member playing their part in the unfolding drama. At the bar, a group of young professionals who had been celebrating a promotion abandoned their champagne to cluster around a phone, pulling up Snoop's recent social media posts about his restaurant experiments. The maitre d' Lara stood frozen at her podium, her earlier dismissiveness of Snoop's casual attire now clearly visible in the Instagram stories being shared across the dining room. Chef Jules emerged from the kitchen, his typical bluster replaced by genuine awe as he realized who had been eating his food. He hovered near the service station, simultaneously trying to maintain his professional dignity and angle for a better view of the scene. Sophia had given up any pretense of returning to her duties, instead positioning herself strategically between the kitchen doors where she could witness everything while providing moral support to Diego through meaningful glances. "Oh my God!" a woman at a nearby table stage whispered to her companion. "This is exactly like that viral video from the steakhouse in Beverly Hills last month." Her dining partner nodded eagerly, adding, "The one where the sommelier tried to steer him away from the expensive wines? That video got like 2 million views." The executive who had been watching earlier was now openly narrating into his phone, live from Harmony Haven, where Snoop Dogg's latest social experiment is reaching its climax. The waiter, who's been condescending to him all night, just realized who he is, and you won't believe what's happening next. Through this growing chaos, Snoop maintained perfect composure, his presence somehow both casual and commanding. He leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing the scene to unfold around him with the patience of someone who had orchestrated similar moments before. When he spoke again, his voice cut through the dining room's excited murmurs with effortless authority. "Y'all mind giving us a minute?" He addressed the room at large, his tone gentle but brooking no argument. "This ain't about your social media feeds. This is about something real." The effect was immediate. Phones lowered, conversations hushed, and attention shifted from documentation to observation. Even the executive, with his live narrative, fell silent, chastened by the quiet dignity of Snoop's request. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, its rhythm matching the subtle tap of Snoop's fingers against the table as he regarded Diego. There was no malice in his expression, no satisfaction in having exposed someone's prejudices. Instead, he carried himself with the air of a teacher who had successfully guided a student to an important realization. "See," Snoop continued, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the attentive audience, while maintaining the intimacy of a personal conversation. "What's happening right now? All these people filming, all these reactions. That's not what this is about. This is about recognition, about seeing past our first impressions to something deeper, less than / and thinking greater than before." Snoop leaned forward, his posture shifting from observer to mentor as he addressed Diego directly. The dining room remained hushed, bearing witness to what was clearly becoming more than just a moment of public shame. The rain had settled into a gentle rhythm outside, providing a soothing counterpoint to the tension of the moment. "You know what I see when I look at you, Diego?" Snoop began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "I see someone who's not afraid to speak their mind, even when they probably should be. Someone who sees through the fancy facades people put up." He gestured to the elegant dining room around them. "That's rare in this industry. Most people learn to swallow their truths, to say what others want to hear." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Now, you've been using that honesty like a weapon, letting your pain turn it into something sharp, but imagine what you could do if you used it to create change instead." The phone on the table had stopped recording, but Snoop's attention remained focused entirely on Diego. "I'm putting together a team at my label, people who can spot authenticity, who aren't afraid to call out the fake when they see it. Lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating their corner of the restaurant as Snoop continued. The music industry is full of yes men, people who will tell artists whatever they want to hear. What I need is someone who will tell them what they need to hear, even when it's uncomfortable. Someone who can see past the image to what's real underneath. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Diego's mind raced, trying to process this sudden shift from public humiliation to potential opportunity. His throat felt tight as he managed to ask, "You're offering me a job? After how I treated you?" Snoop's expression softened slightly. "Because of how you treated me. Your judgment was wrong, but your instinct to question things, to challenge what doesn't sit right with you, that's valuable. We can work on where you point that energy." Diego's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the magnitude of what was being offered. His mother's face flashed in his mind again, but this time, instead of fueling his bitterness, it sparked a different emotion: hope. Yet doubt crept in, manifesting in his hesitant response. "I don't know anything about the music industry. I'm just a waiter who made assumptions about the wrong person." Did he really want to be the receptionist after all? "You're someone who's been fighting against a system that kept your mother sick and your sister out of college," Snoop corrected him gently. "That fight, that fire inside you, that's what I want to channel. The technical stuff, that can be learned. Integrity and the courage to speak up, that's harder to teach." Diego looked down at his hands, still clutching the serving towel that suddenly seemed to represent everything he'd been and everything he might leave behind. The weight of his mother's medical bills, his sister's tuition, the years of accumulated resentment, all of it sat heavy in his chest. But alongside it now bloomed something new. Possibility. "What if I fail?" he asked quietly, voicing his deepest fear. "What if I screw up like I did tonight?" Snoop's response carried both wisdom and challenge. "Then you'll learn from it, just like you're learning from this. Success isn't about never messing up. It's about what you do with those moments when they come. Tonight, you showed me who you are. Now I'm showing you who you could be. Less than / ant thinking, greater than." Diego sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Snoop's offer settling around him like the gentle rain still falling outside. The crystal wine glasses on the table caught and scattered the light, creating tiny constellations that seemed to mirror the possibilities suddenly sparkling before him. Everything about Harmony Haven, the polished silverware, the pristine tablecloths, the carefully measured interactions felt different now, as if he were seeing it all through new eyes. His mother's voice echoed in his memory again, but this time it wasn't her lessons about prejudice that came to mind. Instead, he remembered something she'd told him years ago when he'd first started college. "Sometimes God sends angels in strange disguises, mijo. The trick is recognizing them when they appear." Here he was, having spent the evening judging someone based on appearances, only to discover that this supposed casual diner might be the answer to his family's prayers. The irony of it all struck him with sudden clarity. He had been so focused on the surface level of wealth, the expensive wines, the casual spending, that he'd missed the deeper truth. While he'd been bitter about people who could afford $1,000 bottles of wine, Snoop had been quietly using his success to create real change in the world. The same money that Diego had resented was being channeled into helping families just like his own. His fingers brushed against his phone in his pocket, and he thought about the dozens of unanswered messages from Maria about their mother's medical bills. For months, he'd felt trapped in an endless cycle of working longer shifts and watching the bills pile up faster than he could earn. But now, looking at Snoop's steady gaze across the table, he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. And the restaurant around them seemed to fade into the background as Diego confronted the truth about his own prejudices. He had become exactly what he'd always hated: someone who judged others based on superficial appearances. His years of resentment had blinded him, turning him into the very thing he'd grown up fighting against. The realization was uncomfortable, but it carried with it the possibility of change. His liver more precisely registered fear. "Your honesty can be a gift," his mother had often told him, "but only if you use it to build bridges instead of walls." Tonight, his harsh judgments had unexpectedly built a bridge to something new, not because they were right, but because someone wise enough had seen the potential buried beneath the bitterness. Less than /ant thinking greater than. Diego stood slowly, his movement carrying the weight of decision. The serving towel that had been twisted between his fingers throughout the evening slipped from his grasp, landing softly on the table like a symbol of his old life being set aside. Outside, the storm had finally passed, and moonlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the restaurant's marble floors. "Yes," he said simply, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "If you're willing to take a chance on me, I'm willing to learn." He extended his hand across the table, the gesture representing far more than just accepting a job offer. In that moment, he was reaching across the divide he himself had created, bridging the gap between assumption and reality. Snoop rose to meet him, his own movement deliberate and dignified, their hands clasped in a firm handshake, the contrast of their different worlds dissolving in this simple act of mutual respect and new beginnings. For a brief moment they stood as equals, both understanding the significance of what was transpiring. The restaurant erupted in spontaneous applause. Sophia was the first to break protocol, rushing forward from her watching position to hug Diego fiercely. Chef Jules emerged fully from the kitchen, his typical scowl replaced by a broad smile as he gestured enthusiastically with his hands, crying out, "C'est magnifique!" in his thick French accent. Other staff members gathered around, their earlier wariness of Diego's mood transformed into genuine celebration. Even Thomas, the manager who had warned Diego earlier, approached with a warm smile, clapping him on the shoulder with apparent pride. The maitre d', Lara, dabbed disgressively at her eyes with a corner of her silk scarf. The dining room joined in the celebration, their earlier documentation of drama forgotten in the genuine joy of witnessing redemption. The executive, who had been live streaming earlier, raised his wine glass in a spontaneous toast, and others quickly followed suit. "To second chances," someone called out, and the phrase was echoed around the room, glasses tinkling in the soft light. Less than /ant thinking greater than. The formal atmosphere of Harmony Haven transformed into something warmer and more intimate as the celebration spread throughout the restaurant. Chef Jules, caught up in the moment, ordered champagne for everyone, his usual concerns about the wine budget forgotten in the spirit of the occasion. The pop of champagne corks punctuated the happy chatter that had replaced the earlier tension, like musical notes in an improvised symphony of joy. Sophia orchestrated the distribution of glasses with practiced efficiency, tears of happiness glistening in her eyes as she moved through the room. She paused briefly beside Diego, squeezing his shoulder as she passed. "Your mama's going to be so proud," she whispered, before continuing her rounds. The simple statement caught in Diego's throat, reminding him of all this opportunity meant not just for him, but for his entire family. The regular diners, many of whom had witnessed Diego's sharp edges over the months, raised their glasses in genuine celebration. An elderly couple who came in every Thursday night smiled warmly at him, the woman calling out, "We always knew there was more to you than that tough exterior, young man." Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "Just needed the right person to see it." Even Thomas, the manager, seemed transformed by the evening's events. He stood near the kitchen doors, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer as he watched his staff come together in celebration. When Chef Jules pressed a glass of champagne into his hands, he accepted it without his usual protests about maintaining professional distance. The restaurant's pianist, catching the mood of the room, transitioned from the usual classical repertoire to a gentle jazz melody that seemed to capture the feeling of new beginnings. The music floated through the space, weaving together the various conversations and laughs into a tapestry of shared happiness. Lara, who had first greeted Snoop with such skepticism, now moved through the room with a tray of fresh glasses, her earlier prejudices forgotten in the warmth of the moment. To new perspectives, she offered as she passed Diego's table, her smile genuine and a little sheepish, acknowledging her own lesson learned alongside his, less than / and thinking greater than. As the celebration continued around him, Diego found a quiet moment to step back and absorb the magnitude of how his life had changed in a single evening. Through the restaurant's windows, he could see that the storm had completely cleared, leaving behind a sky scattered with stars. The sight reminded him of something his mother always said about storms, washing the world clean, making everything fresh and new. He pulled out his phone, looking at the string of worried messages from Maria with new eyes. Instead of feeling the usual weight of helplessness, he felt a surge of hope. Tomorrow, he would call her with news that would change everything, not just about their mother's medical bills, but about the possibility of her returning to college. The thought made his throat tight with emotion. The evening's lessons settled deep in his consciousness, reshaping his understanding of wealth, judgment, and opportunity. He had spent so long viewing the world through a lens of bitterness that he had almost missed recognizing genuine kindness when it appeared before him. The irony wasn't lost on him, how his worst behavior had somehow led to his greatest opportunity. Looking across the room at Snoop, who was now chatting easily with Chef Jules about French hip-hop, Diego understood that this wasn't just about a job offer. It was about learning to see beyond surfaces, about transforming anger into action, about using his voice to create change rather than simply express frustration. He needed to be able to look at everything with one eye. Yet, beneath his gratitude, Diego felt the first stirrings of nervous anticipation. Tomorrow he would step into a world he knew nothing about, where his sharp observations would need to be tempered with wisdom, where speaking truth would require more finesse than force. The music industry would bring its own sets of prejudices and assumptions to overcome, its own lessons to learn. The weight of the bow tie at his throat reminded him that this was his last night as just a waiter at Harmony Haven. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new expectations, and undoubtedly new mistakes to learn from. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next, not because he was certain of success, but because he had finally learned that being wrong could sometimes lead to being better, less than / and thinking greater than.